breaking and entering, drunk and disorderly, law and order. A former prosecutor and a defence lawyer, not your typical pairing. And the result? Conversations about crime and punishment that are guaranteed to get you thinking.
Welcome to Justice Matters with Joe Crowley and Lizzie Green, a brand new weekly podcast. Our episodes are available on Apple Podcast, Spotify and YouTube. Check out our Instagram for clips at Justice Matters Pod. Enjoy the episode. This episode contains descriptions of slavery, sexual slavery and some violence. Listener discretion is advised. Hello, Lizzie.
Hi, Joe.
Welcome back.
Thanks. Welcome back to you.
Yeah, thank you. Interesting topic, I hope, today.
Oh, yes.
I've prepared.
Excellent.
Yes. Which came to me. So one of the problems I have as a lawyer, I don't know if you have it, is that when I'm watching movies, I can't help but do legal analysis of the kinds of things I'm saying. So, when I watched Batman versus Superman a couple of years ago, that DC film, the level of violence that Batman delivers to people, I was just like, oh my God, that's a wounding, that's a grievous bodily harm, there's no self-defense there. Anyway, so I was watching Willy Wonka of all movies recently with my son, 7-year-old. He loved it.
Was it your choice though?
No, it was his choice. But I must say I enjoyed it.
Yes.
I really did. And Timothée Chalamet, I am a bit of a fan. And my son loves him. He's got a lovely voice, and Timothée Chalamet has. Anyway, so I watched this movie, Willy Wonka. Spoiler alert, I am going to, for any people who haven't seen the movie yet and want to, I'm going to spoil some of the film for you. There's this scene where he signs this contract. I'll give some more details of it later, but he signs this contract and then he's then effectively used as a slave after that because he can't pay the money that he signs in the contract. And I thought it was interesting because it gave me an idea of how lay people, how non-lawyers sort of view contracts and how strict they are. And it reminded me of The Little Mermaid. I don't know if you're a Little Mermaid fan.
Very familiar with The Little Mermaid.
So I haven't seen the live action. I've only seen the animated version. But you recall that Ariel signs the contract with Ursula the Sea Witch so she can have legs. But the deal is if she doesn't, whatever it is, kiss the prince in 3 days, she's got to... she becomes a little mollusk or something for Ursula.
Sea snail or something.
Yeah. So that I was always intrigued by that contract. And in fact, it's interesting if you Google, Little Mermaid contract problems, there's lots of lawyers who've done articles on the contractual problems in that movie.
Really?
But it struck me, I don't know if you remember, right at the end of the film, so it all comes out that, Ariel is turned into this mollusk in the sea, which is, cave, and King Triton, her father, turns up and he fires his, laser beam from his trident, and Ursula the Sea Witch holds up the contract as a shield and the ray bounces off the contract. And she says, see, it's all legal and legitimate. And I thought, isn't that interesting that, the idea that because the contract is legal, it's unbreakable and even sort of the forces of magic can't, break it. And so I do see this, my kids will often ask me questions about contract. Dad, what happens if I don't pay for this? Will I go to jail? And I thought that's, it's conflating civil law with criminal law. Like there'd be a criminal penalty to some kind of civil wrong that you do, which is just anathema nowadays. If you don't pay your debts, you just, they can get a garnishee order against you or something, or eventually bankrupt you. But it's not that if you fail to pay your debts, you end up in jail.
Although we should clarify,
yes,
if you fail to pay court-ordered money through the criminal courts,
yes, you
could very well end up in jail.
So if anybody's ever bothered to look up the legislation about speeding fines and stuff, you'll see that it's sort of a level of penalty units, which is a monetary penalty, or 2 months imprisonment.
Yes.
So there's always the option, but that is sort of a fine by a court for a criminal or a regulatory offence.
Yes.
Yeah. As opposed to what Willy Wonka faces, which is this civil debt that he can't pay. So what happens in the film is he arrives in Paris as this young chocolate maker, and he has 10 sovereigns in his pocket. And it's this beautiful song at the start where because it's a musical, he's singing about how he's got 10 sovereigns. And during the course of the song, he gives away 9 of his sovereigns and he's only got 1 left. So the song finishes, he's got 1 sovereign left, and he finds a place that'll keep him for 1 night for 1 sovereign. And because he's sure he's going to make his fortune the next day with his chocolates. So, but the hotel owner is this unscrupulous woman who hands him a contract, which, you know, it's one of those comedy contracts which then unfolds into this enormously long document.
Yes.
And he purports to read it. So you find out later in the film that he can't read, but he purports to read it. And then he says, that all seems in order, and he signs it. So he then goes up to his room and comes down the next day to pay his bill. And there's all these hidden charges that he wasn't aware of. So it wasn't one sovereign a night, it was 10,000 sovereigns for the night. And he can't pay. So he's immediately taken by force and he is sent down to the dungeon underneath the hotel to work and to clean the linen. And down there he finds 4 other people who've all been the victims of the same scam, who are all working down there. And it's like a jail. They're kept there and they can't leave, and they have to work to pay off their debt, but they're paid so little that they'll never pay off the 10,000 sovereigns that they've got to pay. And I thought it was it bugs me a bit as a lawyer, because that's not anywhere near how it works. And then I thought, well, why do the script writers, because this is a new story, this is not the original Roald Dahl story. No. I thought, how do they get that idea? And then I thought, it was probably from debtors' prisons. So I'm sure you will know that 18th, 19th century in England, debtors' prisons were a big thing. And so that meant if you couldn't pay your debt and somebody went and got a court order for that debt.
So a debt between private individuals.
Debt between private individuals. One of them goes and gets a court order that you owe that debt. It's a bit like the fine scenario where you pay the debt. In default of paying the debt, you go to debtor's prison and you are put in prison.
Like a proper prison?
A proper prison.
Wow.
The idea of holding somebody until they pay the debt's a pretty ancient idea. There's a reference to it in the Bible.
Could they not just declare bankruptcy?
Well, again, so I mean, probably because I'm a criminal lawyer, I didn't know any of this, but bankruptcy law, as we know, really doesn't come into force till the mid-19th century, so the 1860s. Yeah. So prior to that, you had these debtors' prisons.
Wow.
And then, but these debtors' prisons sort of, because I remember there's a story in the Bible, some parable I think Jesus is telling, and, somebody can't pay their debts, and so they're ordered to be thrown into prison until they pay. And I thought, well, how's that going to work? Because if you can't work, you can't pay your debts. But I think the idea is that then puts pressure on your family to come up with the money. But then debtors' prisons get much more sophisticated. And so by the 19th century in England, certainly, you have these prisons which are workhouses. So you go to the prison and you work off your debt, and the prison effectively runs a business like a laundry business.
So you're not kept there?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, you're kept there.
Oh, you're kept there.
Yeah. And so you're there and you work during the day and, stay at the prison so you can't escape, and until you've worked off your debt. The problem is you also have to pay for your stay as well. So you're working... to pay for your room and board, and then whatever's left over is going to pay your debt.
Fair.
Yeah. Charles Dickens, the English novelist, his father was in debtor's prison. So he recalls as a young man, he had to go out and work, but it's quite young because his father was in debtor's prison, and he visited his father in the debtor's prison. He then writes a novel, Little Dorrit, which is not one of his more famous novels, but it was about debtors' prisons, and it was something that sort of started to lead to the change in the development of this bankruptcy law, which really got rid of debtors' prisons. Although I see that from Wikipedia, my favourite place to go for information.
No, Joe. Not Wikipedia.
I looked at the footnotes, it was reliable sources. 1904 was the last debtors' prison was closed in England. Isn't that amazing?
That's crazy.
Yeah.
Crazy. As in, there were people in there up until then?
Yeah, there were people being held for civil debts. It had to be a court order. But if you could get the court order for it, they could hold you. I thought it was bizarre.
Wow.
But then that got me thinking about this idea, because we're obviously criminal lawyers, not commercial lawyers, about this idea of, well, does that kind of thing, this idea of workhouse or working off a debt or being, have to stay somewhere against your will and continue to work, is that something that still happens? And of course it is. It's called now human trafficking, and it's an offence under our Commonwealth Criminal Code, because it often involves trafficking of humans, which I'll talk about in a second. But the idea of a debt bondage is something that is used in the definitions in human trafficking. So the definition of debt bondage is also known as, debt slavery, bonded labour. It's a pledge of a person's service as security for repayment of a debt or other obligation, where the terms of the repayment are not clearly or reasonably stated, or where the debt is excessively large. The person who holds the debt has thus some control over the labourer, whose freedom depends on an undefined or excessive debt repayment. And that's exactly where Willy Wonka finds himself. The debt is so large he can sort of never work it off. And so the hotelier has this sort of free labour source of all these poor people in her dungeon doing her laundry and cooking.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
So you might recall, this is sort of related to slavery. So you might recall, I think it was in 2020, our then Prime Minister Scott Morrison said there was no slavery in Australia. And he was sort of half right but half wrong in that the idea of slavery, of owning another person, of a person being able to be property, has never been a feature of the law in Australia since its inception. But so if you took that very narrow definition of slavery, then you could say what he said, that there wasn't slavery, but there was behaviours that looked very much like that in Australia, which he later acknowledged. I'm not sure he knew about them, but somebody told him about them, and then he said, okay,
fix this up.
Yeah. So in Australia, what happened, particularly in Queensland, was workers from the South Pacific were brought over to Queensland to work in the cane fields. Now, some of them were brought in a sort of a regular manner, if you like, so that they came to work during the cane season, and they would be paid some money, but deducted from that would be their room and board, and then they'd be delivered home. But the large majority of them were either brought over under false pretenses and then kept longer than they wanted to stay and not paid properly, or in some cases abducted from their South Pacific islands and brought to Queensland and made to work in the
What time period are we talking about?
So this is in the 19th century, so 1800s. So Queensland's declared a state in 1852. But by 1869, the government of Queensland is so concerned about this practice that it brings in legislation where if you were going to bring workers from the South Pacific, you had to be licensed. And
so
I think
regulations.
Yeah. The idea, I think, was that they would then, do sort of good character checks on the people who were being licensed. Okay. The problem was, basically anybody who was doing it got a license. So it looked, although the idea was to regulate and to stop this kind of behaviour happen, it actually ended up entrenching it further, because all of these completely unscrupulous people who'd go out to the islands and recruit, in inverted commas, the labour, they just got licenses and just kept doing what they were doing, but under what looked like
a moneymaker.
Yeah. So that indentured labour, that form of sort of bonded slavery that we had in Queensland didn't completely disappear until 1905. Guess how they got rid of it? They banned South Pacific labourers. They banned people from the South Pacific coming. Oh. So the only way they stopped it was I think it was part of the White Australia policy of sort of banning foreign labour.
Good Lord.
Yeah. So that finished the practice. But yeah, it went on in Queensland for a long time. And I thought to myself, well, how is it that you get people, you're on a Pacific island, you get abducted by somebody and you land in Australia and they go, well, go and work on that plantation. And I thought, well, how is it? Why are the people working on it? And then I thought, well, I suppose they arrive in a foreign country. They don't speak the language. They're offered a shelter and food for work.
And money?
No.
Oh, these ones
Sorry,
weren't paid.
The unscrupulous ones were not being
okay.
paid. Yeah. So I thought, okay, well, I can see why. Yeah, I can see why. You're in a foreign country. You have no means of getting home. You can go out on your own where you have no regular,
and presumably
food
they would know each other.
Yeah, and there's a community. So you can see why they are, although they're not owned by the farmer who's getting to cut
they're shackled.
Well, you wouldn't even need to actually shackle them because
No,
they,
I meant psychologically.
Psychologically, because they can't go anywhere. So they are sort of stuck. And that is what we actually see nowadays in terms of some of the people who are brought to this country to do work. I know you've looked at some of it.
I have. So the first thing not the first thing, but one of the things that I came across was a quote from Archbishop Desmond Tutu. And he said, slavery. I didn't know about all these forms that existed. I think it's largely because we aren't expecting it. It is hidden. Generally, people would not believe that it is possible under modern conditions. They would say, no, I think you are making it all up because it is just too incredible.
Yeah.
But it is not.
No.
This was from the International Labour Organization, and they did a review or investigation into modern slavery, which covers a whole lot of different things, which maybe you'll talk about.
Yeah. But
they said that it occurs in every country in the world, including Australia. And the estimate is that now, 2021, this was, close to 50 million people in modern slavery conditions worldwide. But the thing that really got me about that 50 million is that it went up by 10 million in 5 years. So in 2016, it was 40 million. In 2005, it was 12 million. So we're seeing this exponential growth in these numbers of people.
Yeah. And I remember around the time of the last Soccer World Cup in Qatar, there were complaints about the building of the stadiums and stuff because they were using
slaves.
Well, not slaves in the term of actually owning people, but slaves in the term of debt bondage, in that they would bring workers in but then pay them so little that they could never, sort of earn enough to go home.
Yeah.
And I assume in some cases take their passports so they can't go home. And so they're kept in these horrible conditions, and what can they do? They're in another country. They can work and earn money and get some food and continue to live, or break out on their own. And what happens to you? I
thought when you were talking about this, I had to work out what was meant by slavery and probably modern slavery. So it describes serious violations of human rights. So trafficking in persons, servitude, forced labour, forced marriage, debt bondage, and child labour and deceptive recruiting.
Yes.
So that's all covered by this concept of modern slavery.
Yeah. So that when people, I think, use the term slavery nowadays, they mostly don't actually mean, it seems to me, actually owning another person's property. They mean all of these other methods of controlling.
Yeah.
Interestingly, I found the European Convention on Human Rights actually specifically outlaws imprisoning people for any kind of breach of contract.
Really?
Yeah, and I think the idea behind that is to try and stamp out,
debt bondage.
Yeah, debt bondage, these kind of practices. So the typical case, and the cases that I've seen in practice, I haven't actually seen that many, but I think I've seen one, but there's cases on them, is to work in the sex industry. So in all Australian states now, the sex industry is regulated. So there's acts that license brothels. So it's not illegal.
No.
And people can go and work in these completely legitimately as a sex worker. The problem arises when usually women, are brought in from poorer countries to work in these brothels, or brought in with the offer of work. And I think sometimes the offer of work is, it's not actually specified what the work will be. And then they end up in Australia and their passports are taken and they are put in these brothels, and the only way that they can effectively earn money, they're not held in the brothel.
No.
They can come and go, but they don't get any money unless they work, and they don't have their passport, so they can't get home. And that is I actually saw a case like that from Brisbane, but there's a High Court case where the High Court looked at these matters, which is almost exactly as I described it. So there's 3 people charged. This is the Queen against Tang, which is a 2008 case. And it goes to the High Court because the High Court wanted to give a definition of slavery so that.
So what was the charge?
I think they were under the Criminal Code. Yeah, so they were under these charges that I identified earlier. So under the Commonwealth Criminal Code, the Section 270, they're charged, but they don't exactly know the wording of the charge, but it's some sort of form of human trafficking. That seems to be the terms that's used more often, and then that idea of trafficking or exploitation is then further defined as debt bondage. So 3 people are charged. One of them is the brothel owner, one of them is the brothel manager, and one of them is a woman who worked in the brothels. Now, it was complicated a bit because one of them pleads guilty and the other 2 plead not guilty. So the woman who pleads guilty was effectively the lowest level employee. She was the woman who worked in the brothel, and she pleads guilty to 2 counts of slave trading and 3 counts of possessing a slave. But again, that word slave is defined broadly, not in our traditional sense, but in the idea of...
still the terminology there, possessing.
I know, it's interesting.
Yeah.
What happened? So she pleads guilty. She's then convicted, obviously.
And what sort of sentence do you know?
She got a pretty stiff sentence. She got 9 years, but then reduced on appeal to 6 because they didn't take sufficient account of her backstory.
Right.
So her backstory is that she arrives in the country as one of these women. She's brought into work at the brothel. She actually had no freedom of movement, so she was locked in the brothel. They had her passport, and if you can say any of this is good, the only upside is that it wasn't open-ended. There was a definitive point where she would work off her debt, as it were.
And can I just check? Yeah. So at the time of this case, were brothels legal?
This is from Victoria, and what am I looking at here? Yeah, they would have been. Certainly they were in Queensland.
At that time?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. I wasn't sure when that all went through.
Yeah. So she had to have sex with 700 clients to work off her debt.
Holy moly.
So, as I said, the only upside to that is that at least they put a figure on it. So once she had got to a point, she was actually...
unpaid. So she does that.
She gets room and board.
All of that work.
Yeah.
With no payment.
No payment, and then she can keep working if she wants and get paid.
Could she leave?
Or leave, yes.
Okay.
But I suppose it's a bit like the Stockholm syndrome.
I know.
What happens when she's worked off her debt?
Yeah.
She's then employed by
she's part of the system.
Yeah, the brothel to then recruit young women from Thailand or wherever she was from to come to the brothel under the same circumstances.
That cycle, isn't it?
Yes. So she pleads goes to jail. The brothel owner and the brothel manager plead not guilty, and they actually win in that it goes before a jury, 10 charges, same sort of charges in terms of sexual slavery, blah, blah, blah. The manager, the jury acquit him of 8 of the charges and can't agree on 2. And the prosecution give up the case.
Wow.
Too hard. Well, that's a pretty, it's not a complete defeat for the prosecution, but it's as close
very
as you
telling.
can get to it. Yeah. For the benefit of everybody, the prosecution had the option to run a further trial on those 2 charges where the jury couldn't agree, to retry, but only on those 2 charges. But they obviously decided that, if you can't win
and I wonder if they were more minor charges, rather than the more serious ones.
Yeah.
Because then the utility in prosecuting's not really there, is it?
So that ends up with, I think there's a case stated, goes up to the High Court about what is the definition of slavery? How, are we proceeding on the right basis? So
just on a legal issue, not on...
Legal issue because they are acquitted or then not proceeded with. And the only one who gets punished for it is this
the
poor
lowest
woman,
on the totem pole.
Yeah, who was a victim herself but then becomes an offender. That was that's a...
So what did they say was trafficking?
I'll give the sort of the layman's summary of it. The idea was you effectively exercise power over somebody as if you owned them. Okay. So you restricted their freedom of movement. You restricted their life, in a significant way.
Yeah.
Then that would be considered slavery. So it wasn't, you didn't just have to say, well, I own them. You you've treated them as if you owned them, or they acted towards you as if you owned them. Because
so a broadish definition.
Because as we've sort of talked about, sometimes it's not that these people aren't free to walk around; they are, but their life is effectively controlled because they don't have a passport or they don't have any other way to earn a living. They don't speak the language, so they can't go out and get another job.
They've got no support.
They've got no support network. They don't know anyone except the people who work in the brothel. So they are effectively stuck.
That is interesting. And I think probably if people think about trafficking, the sex industry comes to mind. The other one I think probably is child trafficking, which is not for sex work but for sexual abuse.
Yes.
But I had a look, and both Amnesty International and the United Nations Human Rights Office, they have like little testimonials of people who had been subject to slavery and had been saved.
Oh.
And so they've all got brighter futures now, which is a nice ending
good
to
news
it.
story. Yeah.
But so just to give you little examples, so for forced labour, Diane was a 30-year-old woman from Burkina Faso.
Burkina Faso.
She was kept for 2 years as a domestic slave in the Paris apartment of an affluent family from West Africa after having been trafficked from her home country to France. So similar to the case you said, she was not free to go out of the flat except to take the family's children to school. She was only given leftovers to eat. She was insulted and threatened on a regular basis. She worked 19 hours every day of the week for a monthly salary of 45 euros.
Wow.
So after 2 years, she finally got the courage to escape from that house while she was running an errand, and she got in contact with people who were able to support her, and she was freed.
Yeah.
You don't think that would happen in the 2020s,
No. Yeah.
I ran into a colleague recently who's in Singapore, and she was talking about domestic help. And this is in Singapore.
Yeah.
And I mean, they have regulations, they have standards that are meant to be met, but she said they're not. And people know that they're not. And people put their own terms on how many days off you get or how much you're going to get paid or what your accommodation is. And these people need the work. And so they do it in subpar standards and not according to regulation. And it's open. Like you can look on Facebook and see these are my terms, come and apply.
Yeah.
And people apply.
Yeah. Well, it was that. What was the definition you read out before about you tricking people in terms of the labour arrangements or something?
Deceptive recruiting.
Deceptive recruiting.
For labour or services.
Yeah. Although in some senses that's not deceptive recruiting if you're putting it up on Facebook. These are my terms.
Well, yeah. I think the problem there is the lack of enforced regulation.
Yes.
The knowledge that it's happening, but not
and taking advantage of these people because of their economic vulnerabilities. The idea of the deceptive recruiting. So there was another case. This one was out in New South Wales. Married couple convicted of 5 offences of intentionally possessing a slave and 5 of using a slave. Their victims were Thai women, and they were used in the brothel run by the married couple. 4 of the 5 women were told they were coming to Australia. They were told that it was sex work, but they were told that it was just massaging and that sex, actually having sex with clients was optional.
Was this one of the happy endings?
Yeah, yes. I didn't feel I had to paint the entire picture, but yes, it was not a remedial sports massage. No,
what we're talking about, because you say it was for sex work, but just massages. My husband gets massages regularly, so I'm just clarifying what I need to be on the lookout for.
Well, yes. Well, I don't know what you need to be on the lookout for because I haven't been into one.
Poor David, he'll be so embarrassed.
Yeah. Having said that, my wife, who works in different cities around Australia, was in a city that she was unfamiliar with and went out to get a massage and went into a massage bar.
They don't advertise it.
And they said, we don't do that kind of massage here. And they just turned her away.
thankfully.
Yes. So, I mean, hopefully it wasn't a massage parlor or a brothel like this one, which had these poor Thai women working in it. And as I say, they were told that sex with clients was optional. So they knew something, but they didn't.
Optional but not required.
Yes. What was required in inverted commas was the massaging. But of course, when they arrived,
Option.
there was no option, and they were again kept. They weren't allowed to leave. Passports taken, and of course, language barrier.
What year was this case?
That's 2010.
Okay.
Yeah.
See, I thought to myself, maybe a little bit like Desmond Tutu, that it doesn't happen.
Yeah.
But so then I went and looked because I love statistics.
Yes, I
went
do.
and looked, and the AFP, the Australian Federal Police, released a report of the 2022 to 2023 financial year.
Yep.
So recent.
Yes.
In the 12 months that they were reporting on, these are the offences that were reported or received by the Australian Federal Police.
Wow.
90 reports of forced marriage, 90 of trafficking, 73 of sexual exploitation, 43 of forced labour, 18 of debt bondage, 16 of domestic servitude, 6 of deceptive recruitment, and 4 of slavery as a general term. Like that's...
Yeah. I mean...
To me, that is almost unbelievable. But then we know better than anyone the things that people do to other people. And I just think that is outrageous.
Yeah. But I mean, the lowest number there was 4, but it was of actual slavery in the 21st century in Australia.
Yes.
Yeah, just mind-blowing. You just think...
It really is.
Yeah, so forced marriage is one that does come up in the definitions. So obviously very different from the Willy Wonka scenario where he's working off a debt, but illegal in this country. But something that you do see. I've seen a forced marriage case. Forced
by the spouse or by family?
Yeah, forced by family to marry somebody that
for financial gain or something?
I think for cultural reasons.
Right.
So, but forced marriage it's also a war crime. Or is it a crime against humanity? Certainly it's one of the crimes that the International Criminal Court can
And when we say
prosecute.
Forced marriage, we're not talking arranged marriage.
No, well, an arranged marriage would be, like Married at First Sight TV show, in that you agree that you'll marry somebody. So you're doing it voluntarily. You just have only met them recently or whatever. It's not a marriage in the sense of a romantic sort of
blurring of the lines. Like an arranged marriage is often organised by the parents, not by the parties.
No.
So is there a blurring of the lines there?
Well, I think there could be. I mean, marriage has to be entered into consensually, voluntarily. And if it's not a proper marriage. And, well, I suppose there might be some other elements to it, but in terms of a forced marriage. So, but I mean, we in a Western society have these notions of marriage being a romantic attachment, whereas that's something particular to Western society. There's lots of other cultures who don't see it as that, and they do see it as some more of an arrangement than
transactional.
Yeah, transactional. And I mean, I don't think there's anything necessarily wrong with that, provided people are entering into it voluntarily.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I had some other I shouldn't say good stories. No. That's not what I mean.
No.
Oh yeah. So this was Jonah Lynn. And she left her home in the Philippines and travelled to the Middle East to work as a domestic worker for a family in Lebanon.
Yeah.
So for nearly a year, she suffered severe psychological and physical torture at the hands of her employers. She was imprisoned in solitary confinement for 10 days, was threatened constantly with death.
Yeah.
She endured physical and sexual abuse.
Yeah.
One time her employer poured chlorine-based detergent over her body and she had some open wounds.
Oh.
And then subjected her to electric shocks using a stun gun.
Yeah.
So it was only when she came in contact with Caritas, one of their subsidiaries that she was able to escape.
Yeah.
She accepted a plea bargain from her employer. So there were charges brought, or a case brought against her employer, and she accepted a plea bargain of US $20,000 and an airline ticket home to just escape and start fresh.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's understandable. I mean, maybe from a public policy point of view.
I think good on her. Like, I wish it had been more, you know. But just even reading these, you just think, firstly, how can people think it's all right to treat someone else like that? But then if we go back through history, people have always thought it's all right to treat other people however they see fit. And it's down to power and money and position, isn't it? Yeah,
absolutely. The exercise of power, the strong over the weak. That's, I think, a common theme in human history.
I had a little look because one of the implications of modern slavery are things like sweatshops and impacts of climate change forcing people to have no money, food, having to move, try and find menial jobs. You
mentioned this before the episode, and I was wondering how climate change fed into slavery.
Climate change has affected children. It begins with food insecurity. Due to climate change, people are unable to get food because farms aren't producing it.
Yeah.
So that leads to families and children having to make these really horrific choices, either die of hunger or subject themselves to human trafficking.
Yeah.
And the other thing then is there's a lack of education that flows on, and so it becomes this cycle of not being able to break away. And so that's part of the current issue.
Yeah.
The UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, said in 2023 that we have to move much faster to stop this terrible crime of modern slavery. Countries must legislate, protect the rights of victims, and eradicate the practices and conditions that allow modern slavery to flourish.
Yeah.
And so I had a little look, and there's not a lot, but there is some legislation in Australia about like the corporate risks of slavery, and so the sweatshops and that sort of thing. There are ethical practices, and there's legislation federally and in New South Wales, specifically modern slavery legislation that specifically looks at sort of forced labour scenarios. And
so is that if they find out that there's a sweatshop in another country where it's using forced labour or slavery, it's then illegal for companies in Australia to do business with them?
Well, it asks companies to look at their supply chains wherever they are and to improve working conditions where they can, and then encourage greater transparency and awareness. At the moment, it lacks the authority in our legislation to affect meaningful change through consequences, but we've now got some, in New South Wales, there's some anti-slavery commissioner who's there's been talk this year of extra powers and responses.
Yeah, that is a problematic area to police, in that the offences, the slavery offences, aren't occurring in Australia.
No.
And you are then, the government is then trying to stop Australian companies from using those sweatshops.
That's right. So they say the Anti-Slavery Commissioner's functions include advocating for and promoting action to combat modern slavery, identifying and providing assistance and support for victims of modern slavery, support to and oversight of public procurement efforts to remove products of modern slavery from supply chains.
Right.
Issuing codes of practice, maintaining a public register, and raising community awareness. So they're not criminal sanctions.
No.
They're not actions to force anyone to do anything, but it's this legislated awareness of the issue.
Yes.
I guess maybe a little bit like our Human Rights Act identifies what we should be doing.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was thinking. The Human Rights Commissioner, which doesn't have any punitive or coercive powers, it has a role in advocating and
And I don't know if you heard it, but I read somewhere recently, I heard someone that, Shein, I don't know if your children shop on this online, very cheap shop. Another one's Temu or Temu.
Right.
Really cheap clothes and products, And there was, I heard that Shein was getting shut down because of the related issues with supply.
Yes.
But I still get emails from them. So
Oh, dear. Oh,
yes, I'm assuming they're still there.
Yeah.
But, it is that sort of thing, this really cheap products that are out there, which is so tempting to purchase. But you need to look behind it and see, well, how is it so cheap? Who's actually suffering as a result of your cost saving?
Yeah. Fast fashion.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly right.
I mean, this idea of sort of legislating or creating laws to stamp it out is difficult in that circumstances, because the laws that we have in Australia, I think, are pretty good. I mean, it's criminalised for a start.
Yeah.
But I noticed that in a number of these cases where these poor, usually women are being brought to this country, that some associated charges are breaches of the Immigration Act, because it's immigration fraud, because they're lying on the, not the victims themselves, but the people who bring them, who fill out the visas, are lying about the reasons for them coming, or I don't know what the lies are, but there seems to be, in a number of these cases, there's also fraud offences under the Migration Act.
I was surprised that you had those cases to talk about, because Australia has criminalised all forms of modern slavery.
Yep.
I have never come across cases.
No.
So that, I mean, it's good that there are those repercussions when they know it, but I also think so many of them wouldn't know their options or be able to access any help or options. Yeah. And that's the issue, isn't it?
Well, so much of these cases that you talked about and I talked about it's a coercive control. We've been talking about that in Queensland in terms of domestic relationships, but it's a coercive control, lots of threats of violence or, taking away people's passports.
And I think we're really lucky here that we don't have the same issue with child soldiers, which is a really big one.
Yeah.
The number of child soldiers is terrifying.
Yeah. You should explain. I think it should be a little bit of child. Oh, well, I'll briefly do it. So there has been some prosecutions for child soldiers. They seem to come out of civil wars in Africa, where guerrilla groups would recruit children. Obviously, they had to be old enough. They're usually male children, I think. Well, I think, as soldiers, they'd recruit them, young male children, but the children had to be old enough to hold and shoot a gun. But then they would indoctrinate them and make them go out and fight as soldiers. And that's a difficult thing when you're fighting against it, because you're having to shoot sort of 12-year-old, 13-year-old, 14-year-old boys who are standing there with an AK-47 pointed at you.
So they said, the United Nations said that hundreds of thousands of children in more than 40 countries are being forced or tricked into becoming soldiers. Yeah. So that number is incomprehensible.
Yes.
But so I don't think we've got that issue here. But when we think about all of those different types of slavery that we recognise now, it is still a current issue.
Yeah, in this country. Yep. Absolutely. I mean, I hope I haven't spoilt people's enjoyment of the lovely musical that is Willy Wonka. And I certainly encourage everyone to go and see it.
Definitely went down a rabbit hole.
Absolutely.
From the contract there, but that was so interesting.
Yeah. Was it? Oh, lovely. I'm glad you enjoyed it.
Oh, okay. Well, thanks, Joe.
Thanks, Lizzie.
See you next time.
Thanks for tuning into this episode. You can find links to the cases that we discussed in the description. You can also find a link to Guardian Criminal Law, and a big shout out to them for making this podcast possible.
The majority of criminal cases involve people, normal people, people like you, people like me, who find themselves in an unusual set of circumstances that would not usually occur in their life. My name's Mark Savick, and I'm here to assist you with your criminal matter. I look forward to hearing from you and being of assistance to you.
If you're interested in clips, you can look at them on Instagram and TikTok. Just search for Justice Matters Pod. See you next episode.